Greetings, Blogging Heads audience. My name is Matt Duss. I'm a blogger for the Wonk Room at the Center for American Progress Action Fund and Think Progress. And I'm joined today by Noah Pollak. Noah, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi there, everyone. I'm a assistant editor at the Middle East Quarterly, and I blog on commentaries, blog contentions.
All right. Well, we're talking about the Middle East today. Noah and myself are both mainly concerned with Middle East issues. So let's get right to it. The first issue is Israel. I just got back from a trip to Israel with AIPAC. I think everybody knows who AIPAC is. Had a really good time. Had a lot of really good briefings. And basically, the message I bring back to you from Israel is that a lot of Israelis are really concerned about Iran. And obviously, they're concerned about the situation between Hamas and Fatah in the territories. But one thing, I was there I was there for the prisoner swap between the Israelis and Hezbollah, the prisoners who were taken, which started the 2006 war with Hezbollah, and that was very moving to be in Israel at that time. And some of the explanations that were given to me by different Israelis over why Israel might have agreed to this. What's your view on that, Noah?
I think the swap was sort of in Israel. What I gathered from being over here during the swap was that it was essentially a sort of a choice between two different horrors. One was the continuing to not know what had happened to Regev and Goldwasser, and sort of the burden that had imposed on Israeli society of thinking that there was a possibility that these two IDF soldiers were still alive and captive in Lebanon, and that Israel is a small country in which everyone has family and friends who are in the military, and it's sort of difficult, I think, for Americans to understand the closeness with which Israelis sort of experience tragedies that happen in the military. So there was this sort of a terrible burden of not knowing what had happened to these two guys. And that was weighed against the other horror, which was to release living terrorists, child murderers, to red carpet welcoming celebrations in Lebanon. And most people from my political camp think that what Israel did was a disaster, and I think that there were good parts of it and bad parts of it, and I'm not even really sure if the good outweighs the bad, although I suspect it does, because now among the Israeli populace there is a sort of bookend on the Lebanon war and knowing what happened to their soldiers. So the problem with it, from a sort of strategic context, was that it imperiled, I think, the lives of future Israeli prisoners, because Israel did not even bother to verify or insist on verifying before agreeing to the swap whether or not these two guys were still alive. And so it sort of reduced the incentive on the part of people who capture Israeli soldiers at keeping them alive, because if Israel's willing to swap live people for what are corpses, there's not a whole lot of incentive for taking live
No,
people.
I think that's...
and it also, I think, for Lebanon was bad because it threw a real lifeline to Nasrallah, who at that moment was probably more isolated in Lebanon than he had ever been after the war in 2006, and after the sort of rampage through Beirut that happened in May. He was very much hated in Lebanon, and this gave him an opportunity to sort of mount a sort of a festival of his defense of Lebanon by humiliating Israel.
Yeah, I think I agree with mostly all of that, and I'll just say that a lot of people I spoke to in Israel made those exact points, and how they answered them for themselves as well as to me was just to say, listen, we understand that, yes, this strategically and tactically makes little sense. I mean, it raises Israel's costs in terms of force protection. It creates incentives for Hezbollah to take prisoners in the future. But as you said, I mean, Israel is a country, almost everyone serves in the military. Certainly everyone knows and has family in the military. And there is kind of a bargain or an agreement between the government of the State of Israel and the families of Israel that we will do whatever we have to do to get your children back to you. And I was just, as I said, I was very moved to hear people explain that to me. And I think that says a lot about Israel. And we can sit here.
There was one aspect of it that I thought was very, very dangerous, and that is that Hezbollah has now sort of positioned itself as being really on the forefront of resistance against Israel, and that's something that has a lot of dangers to it, because what it does is it sort of the Arab street, so to speak, looks to Hezbollah admiringly as a force that is brave and willing to take the fight to Israel.
Right.
And there's a problem of if things flare up, for example, in Gaza, there's now going to be more pressure than ever on a group like Hezbollah to join the fight, because they are sort of looked upon as the brave resistance against Israel.
Yeah, we saw that after.
For Israel, sorry, go ahead.
No, please finish.
Oh, for Israel, there's just this danger of these sort of this being yet something else that enhances the sort of credibility of Hezbollah as a fighting force and puts internal pressure on Hezbollah to always be seen as at the forefront of taking the fight to Israel. And so the thing that I worry about now is that if Israel has to mount an operation in Gaza, that this is going to the prisoner swap essentially increase the likelihood of Hezbollah getting involved in a conflict that's not in southern Lebanon.
Right. I think that's true. But I mean, also after the 2006 war, the summer 2006 war, I mean, one of the least remarked upon, or I think probably the most important photo of that year, in my view, that I saw was a photo of a demonstration in Cairo during the bombing that was taking place during the war, where you had a huge picture of Nasrallah being held up next to a huge picture of Nasser. And to understand, I mean, to see this Shia militia leader held up next to, the icon of Arab nationalism, I think was huge. As far as, the role that this plays, this idea of resistance, that now Nasrallah is kind of a new standard bearer. I mean, yeah.
This is part of a larger problem with, and we'll get to Iran later, but one of the larger problems in the region of the way that the Iranians have been very successful in sort of jumping the sectarian divide. One of the ways that they do that is by using the state of Israel, because in the Middle East, people who show their contempt for Israel and their willingness to fight against Israel are celebrated as great heroes, and it's part of the sort of one of the more regrettable aspects of the Arab culture in the Middle East. And because of that, yes, someone like Nasrallah, who previously was, as you say, a Shia militia leader, is suddenly being celebrated as one of the most popular figures in the entire Middle East, as has the Iranian president, who along with Nasrallah, is also celebrated as one of the most popular leaders in the Middle East, precisely because of his willingness to be bold and aggressive in denouncing Israel.
Right. So, I mean, let's get to that question then. I mean, we had the Annapolis conference last November. We've got the Bush administration, especially Condoleezza Rice now, who seems to be, using these last months of the Bush administration to try to get something going or get something resolved, in regards to the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. What do you see happening there, if anything, and what do you see in the future as far as an agreement or some kind of lessening of the war here? I mean, can Israel? Do you see Israel integrating into the region in a genuine way in the future?
I don't really think so. I think that right now the sort of cost for a lot of different regimes to try to sort of normalize their relations with Israel is too high. I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think, remains one of those things that regional despotisms use. They sort of uphold it to their people as a safe place for their people to express their outrage and their contempt, and it's too valuable of an asset. The perpetuation of the conflict is too valuable of an asset for a lot of these regimes to really actively participate in its resolution, and it's why you've seen. I think there's been maybe perhaps a little bit of a softening lately with the Arab Peace Initiative and things like that, which at least I don't think it was a terribly serious offering, but at least it was a step in the right direction. But for many of these regimes, it's difficult to imagine how they're going to. An example of this is the Iranian threat, and how even the threat, this sort of natural alliance with Israel against the Iranian threat, has really not been enough to encourage the Sunni states to get on board. But it's the problem, that's the sort of regional picture, but I think the problem with Annapolis and the problem with this and this is where it's something I'm sure we disagree on, with these U.S.-mediated attempts at creating a peace between Israel and the Palestinians, is in my opinion, there's sort of a problem of defining the premises of the conflict and the premises of the people involved. And you hear this sort of talk, mostly from people on the left who are very sort of adamant about the need for the peace process, that statehood is something that can sort of be bestowed on the Palestinians, and what we have is sort of a conflict that centers around things like refugees and water rights and some border issues, and that if all of those things can be hammered out in negotiations, we will have statehood. And I think people from sort of my side of things view the problem as being perhaps a bit more intractable and a bit deeper, in the sense that statehood is not something that can simply be bestowed on people. You have to have a people who are possessed of a very nationalist understanding of their culture and their community, and that one of the timeless problems with statehood for Palestinians is that the Palestinians have often not really behaved as if statehood was something that they were terribly interested in.
Yeah, I do disagree with that. I mean, there is in this country, it seems like raising that question of whether the Palestinians actually are a people is still something that it's acceptable to talk about, in a way that it's really not acceptable to talk about, for instance, about the Jews, whether the Jews represent a people deserving of statehood in the way, I think even the New York Sun, as part of their style guide, even just specifically refers to just the Palestinian Arabs as opposed to the Palestinians. As far as the scholarship on this question, I don't even think the question is more or less closed at this point. I think the Palestinians began to show evidence of a national identity around the same time, and for many of the same reasons that different Arab groups throughout the Middle East did through the mid-1800s. It certainly took on a different cast because of the Palestinian experience with Zionism. But that by no means, in my view, means that Palestinian identity is simply a reaction to Zionism. Certainly Zionism influenced Palestinian national identity. And by the way, I think Palestinian national identity also influenced Zionism in a number of very interesting ways. But I think, let's look at what's gone on here. I think for the entirety of their national, the existence of this national conception, the Palestinians have in fact been under one occupation or another. So I think it's very difficult now to look at them and kind of criticize them for not having built the institutions of a state when you understand all the different pressures that were being put on them. Now, I don't want to treat them as purely as victims. I think certainly they've missed a lot of opportunities. There's been a lot of corruption. There's been a lot of irresponsibility. But I think the basic fact of the Palestinians' attempt to build their institutions is the fact of occupation.
Right. Let me take the argument one step further. I think you can say, and I probably agree with the idea that there is a sort of a group of people who consider themselves Palestinian. But the question, I don't think, is really whether or not there's a group of people who consider themselves Palestinians, or whether or not there is a people called Palestinians. The question is this a group of people whose objective in their sort of community and in their peoplehood is one of actually building a state that becomes part of a very sort of loose regional system, and that is willing to live in peace with a country that it has a long and sort of sorry history with, or is this a group of people that is really a much more sort of loosely defined group? And I think evidence for the latter is what we're seeing right now, which is that we basically had for the past 3 years a low-level civil war. Among the Palestinians of Gaza versus the Palestinians of the West Bank. And this is heating up as we speak. Over this past week, there have been a number of shootings and killings and violence and people expelled and arrested and tortured and things like this between Fatah and Hamas. Yeah. And, these are sort of clashes for supremacy among the Palestinians themselves. That really have nothing to do, I think, with the question of statehood. They have to do with the understanding of the role of religion among the Palestinians and the understanding of the trajectory of the Palestinians as a community. Hamas, which won a large percentage of the vote in the Palestinian legislative elections in 2006, is not a Palestinian nationalist movement. Hamas says nothing about wanting to create a Palestinian state in their charter, and they to this day they still don't talk about it. They talk about fighting for Palestinian rights, and they talk about destroying Israel, but they certainly don't talk about creating a sort of modern nation state called Palestine. They're sort of a believer in caliphate.
No, I don't. Yeah, I disagree with
it. Seems to me like there's a huge open question here about what the Palestinians themselves don't appear to have sort of settled in a way on what they want their nation to be.
Right. No, I understand what you're saying, but I would take issue with your statement about Hamas. I mean, I think when the Muslim Brotherhood kind of formed, elements of the Muslim Brotherhood became Hamas around the time of the first Intifada, they did take on a very specifically nationalist cast. I mean, I think they definitely assimilated elements of nationalism as we understand it. It's certainly an Arab and Islamic form, an Islamist nationalism, and that might first seem to be a contradiction. I mean, it's certainly a tension. But, I mean, they've been criticized, I mean, by, for instance, Iran and Ayatollah Khamenei, who's criticized Hamas's nationalism because they see, Khamenei sees that as contradictory to the idea of an Islamic ummah, a united Islamic people. So I think, I certainly understand your point, but I think there's a really good book that just came out. It's a new study of Hamas called Hamas in Politics by Jerome Gunning. He wrote it over the course of 10 years, did extensive field work, field interviews, and it's really the most in-depth examination of Hamas's political ideology and its political program that's yet been done. And I would highly recommend it. The basic premise, I mean, it certainly doesn't underplay Hamas's violence or how, in my view, objectionable Hamas's, goal of destroying Israel is. But I think Hamas.
What about in the sense of internal Palestinian politics, this problem that Hamas is a group which has a large popular following among the Palestinians. And by the way, one of the reasons for Hamas's great popularity among the Palestinians, people always talk about how they won these elections purely because of Fatah's corruption and things like that. There was another very important factor, which was that a few months earlier, Israel disengaged from Gaza, which, by the way, I thought was the right thing to do. Israel disengaged from Gaza, and Hamas was credited by the people with being the sort of the reason for that. And so there's sort of an internal question here about a group that has characteristics of Hamas, and I'm thinking of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, which I sort of have come to call Islamic supremacist groups. And these are groups that they don't really do politics. And you keep seeing this with Hamas, either in their relations with Egypt, with Israel, and especially with their relations with other Palestinian parties, particularly Fatah, in which Hamas rules by the gun. They rule by brutality. They rule by harassing and beating people. And there's this question, before I think anyone talks seriously about Palestinian statehood, there's this question of, what do we do about Islamic supremacism among the Palestinians in the form of Hamas? Where Hamas, after they took over Gaza, there was this national unity government that was formed in Mecca, the Mecca Agreement, and the leaders of Hamas went and met with the leaders of Fatah, and they hammered out this agreement. And shortly thereafter, a couple months later, Hamas chased all of Fatah out of Gaza and was killing people. And today is as entrenched there as they I think have ever been. So the question is, how is any group of Palestinians supposed to do politics, supposed to integrate a group of people like Hamas into any sort of state system? I mean, how is that supposed to go down? Because Hamas basically, when you disagree with them or you challenge their power, they kill you if they can.
Right. No, it's a good question, but I'll just say that when Hamas took power, I mean, the United States and Israel made clear from the very beginning that Hamas would not be allowed to rule. They would not be accepted. Now, it's interesting that a lot of people that I spoke to in Israel, I mean, people who are completely, of course, opposed to Hamas, said Hamas should have just been allowed to try to pick up the garbage. If they would have failed, they would have failed. I mean, what happened was the worst, the worst of both worlds is that the United States pushes for elections, and then we refuse to recognize the result. So, but the question of how to integrate a group like Hamas into a political system, I mean, it's a tough question. I mean, my point about their political ideology is just that, I mean, I think Hamas does need to be understood as a political group that uses terrorism. I think it's a mistake to just view them as a terrorist group that uses politics to facilitate terrorism. I mean, they do have a goal. Okay, their goal is more than just the destruction of Israel. Israel happens to be a particularly reprehensible part of their program, but their goal is to create an Islamic society. And just going back very quickly, not to belabor this, but I think there's too little appreciation for how deeply the leaders of Hamas have thought through the idea, the tension between divine authority and representative authority, because they really have. I mean, the work that's been done. I mean, they really have thought through this. So I think they've shown that they've engaged with Western thought, particularly John Locke, what he talks about, natural law versus, the law, representative law. Where does one locate legitimacy? So. Yeah, it's a tough question, but I just think they're a lot more nuanced and complicated than they're generally giving credit for. Now, if I can just get back very quickly to what you're talking about as far as the Palestinians' national conception, I think that is an important point. But let's look at the U.S. Civil War. I mean, let's look at the U.S. now. I mean, there are people in this country, there are members of my own family who have a very different conception of what America is than I do. Granted, we're not going after each other with guns, but that's because we have a legitimate state and we have working institutions, whereas I can come to the Center for American Progress and push for policies I like, and they can go elsewhere and push and advocate for policies that they like. But I think
but that's because of sort of profoundly different cultures and ways of handling power in Western societies versus the Middle East. The way that we repeatedly see sort of power challenging happen in the Middle East is that groups sort of gather guns and go out and try to assert themselves. Mm-hmm. And one of the takeaways that I've taken from the past few years of first living in Israel for a couple of years and working there and then coming back to Washington is the incredible failure of trying to integrate groups like Hamas and Hezbollah into any sort of state, democratic, or political systems. I mean, we'll get to Lebanon later, but we've seen this with Hezbollah in Lebanon, where the attempt to play politics with Hezbollah has basically been a disaster. Mm-hmm. And I think that the attempt to play politics with Hamas has basically been a disaster. Hamas is absolutely dedicated to victory. Mm-hmm. And the Hamas government there in Gaza has shown repeatedly that it is willing to engage in any abuse of its own people. Right. For its own goals and its own victory. I mean, Hamas has been in the sort of quote unquote Israeli siege of Gaza, where fuel and medical supplies and food and water still get in.
Well, why do you call it quote unquote a siege? I mean, it's a siege.
Hamas has repeatedly attacked the crossing points where fuel and food and medicine get in, so that Israel can't send things into Gaza, so that Hamas can then complain to its sort of apologists in the international press about the horrors of.
No, I understand.
I mean, I would agree. I agree with you that Israel has not handled Gaza very well at all, but there is definitely an absolute willingness on the part of Hamas to viciously abuse the Palestinian people so that it can continue its fight. And I submit to you the following. There is no way that Palestinian statehood can come about without before it the destruction of Hamas, and there is no way that Israel can live in peace without the destruction of Hamas as well, as a sort of going as a going entity among the Palestinians that has credibility and popularity.
I mean, I would just respond to that by saying that you will not see a political force among the Palestinians that can take on Hamas while the occupation continues. I mean, this has been the case for years. I mean, people continue to scream about this.
Well, but I mean, everyone from King Abdullah in Jordan to Mahmoud Abbas and the IDF and the Mossad and all these different groups will tell you that if the Israeli sort of security presence in the West Bank were to be withdrawn, you would immediately have a Hamas takeover.
Right. I'm not talking about an immediate.
A little bit of a Gordian knot.
No, I agree with that. I mean, that's well put. I would just say, a commitment on the part of Israel just to recognize, first of all, that this occupation has gone on far too long. It's been extremely brutal. These settlements are deeply provocative, and a commitment to withdraw them. I mean, I think that is really what underlies a lot of Hamas's success, is that they saw the PLO accept Israel. They saw the handshake on the White House lawn. They saw the PA coming in. I mean, criticisms of the PA aside, and Arafat and the corruption, leaving that aside for the moment, the Palestinian people themselves saw all this negotiation taking place, and they saw the occupation getting tougher. They saw the settlements expanding. So it's not surprising why Hamas would gain from this.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's definitely true, and I would agree with you that I think there's a difference between settlements and the occupation. I mean, I think the occupation is something that in a lot of ways, not to delve into history here too much, but is something that Israel, that after the Six-Day War, Israel simply had to deal with. They suddenly came into possession of territory in which a great number of Arabs lived.
Sure.
But which posed a sort of a security problem. I would agree with you on the settlements that some sort of compromise needs to be reached there, where the major long-standing settlement blocks are integrated into Israel and there are land swaps, and that's sort of that's a part of the deal that I think is okay. Except just to get back to the sort of Annapolis and the peace process is that this is something that. My overall take on the peace process is that this is something that has become sort of a necessity for American presidential administrations, that this is something that Europeans demand, that the UN demands, that a lot of the Arab states demand, and America has to sort of pursue a drip of peace processing and background diplomacy to keep a lot of people happy so that America has more freedom to do things in other parts of the world. But that this is not something that I don't know if anyone in the U.S. administration other than Condi Rice actually believes that anything here is possible right now. You have, and this gets back to the issue of Palestinian nationalism, is you have the one Palestinian leader who professes to be willing to live peacefully with Israel happens to be an unbelievably weak figure, and he's about to step down in 2009, and there doesn't appear to be anyone to take his place who has any real sort of command over the Palestinian people, which gets back to my point, which is that I'm not sure the Palestinians themselves have decided what they really stand for, and I think back to in just their neighbors there in the 30s and 40s, I don't think there was really anyone or any group of people among the Jews who were living in Palestine of the British Mandate who didn't all believe in creating a Jewish state. That was why they were there.
Right.
I don't think you see anywhere near that kind of.
Well, no, I think that's a fair point, but I also think even among the Jews of the Yishuv, there was a broad swath of opinions what this state should be. Should it be socialist?
Right.
Should it be religious? And those, I will say, I find it very interesting, those disagreements persist to this day. They just developed the institutions through which they work this question out.
There's this whole joke in Israel about how if the Arabs really want to destroy Israel, they should just stop attacking Israel for 20 years and Israel will destroy itself internally. I don't think that's true, but that's something that's a favorite thing that people say.
Well, if I could just one quick point before we move on. I do. The question of national institutions, state institutions, is a really important one. And when I look at, you said, the settlements and the occupation are two different things. I don't really think that they are. I understand the way. The settlements have always been justified, at least by Israeli leaders, with a security justification to say that we're taking this hill, we're doing that to because we need to keep a presence in Israel, or in the West Bank and formerly in Gaza. And when you look at the policies of the occupation to facilitate these settlements, you look at the policies that were taken by the occupation, the military rulers of the West Bank and Gaza. They pursued policies which were specifically designed to frustrate the creation of Palestinian national institutions. To put it another way, the posture of Israel since 1948 and especially after 1967 was to look at Palestinian national identity itself as a national security threat toward Israel, and they created policies accordingly. So, we saw, the breaking of trade unions, the breaking of student unions, the crushing of nascent Palestinian institutions. This is what the justification for the support that was given to the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood as an Islamist alternative to Fatah before the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood eventually became Hamas. So it's really kind of tough for me to listen to, kind of conservative supporters of Israel blame the Palestinians for not having created state institutions when you understand that the goal of the Israeli occupation for many years was to crush Palestinian institutions.
I'm not. That's not sort of a history of the occupation that I give a lot of credence to. It's convenient to try to portray the sort of the posture of the Israeli government toward the Palestinians is one of sort of unrelenting hostility. The reality of the West Bank after 1967 was that there was an incredible level of integration of Palestinians into Israel. There was effectively open borders. There was a massive number of Palestinians who worked in Israel. The Israeli economy was integrated with the West Bank and with Gaza. There was not checkpoints. There were really none of these things. And if you look at the economics of the West Bank under the occupation post 67, which is said to be so terrible, GDP growth was pretty much double digits every year, and there was an unprecedented expansion in Palestinian standard of living, in economic opportunities, in infrastructure, and all of these things. And it was only when violence flared up that there was this clampdown. I mean, if you remember, before Operation Defensive Shield during the Second Intifada in 2002 and 2003, there really was no occupation. I mean, Jenin had not been occupied. And the reason you see such an aggressive security posture today in the West Bank is precisely because Israel suffered through several years of a suicide bombing war. And yes, I mean, when it comes down to restaurants in Tel Aviv blowing up versus checkpoints in the West Bank, there's going to be checkpoints in the West Bank, and that's just the way the world works. And so, look, I'm not saying that Israel, of course, has handled everything perfectly or anything like that. But given the situation, you know, I don't know. It's just one of those things that there's countervailing histories, and I don't think it's really true that the Israeli government set out to sort of humiliate and crush the Palestinians over those years. And there was really quite open. There was a great deal of openness between the two societies, and there actually was not that much hostility after the 6 Day War. And it was only, you know, sort of the rise of Yasser Arafat and things like that brought in the sort of in the nurturing of eliminationist terrorism in Palestinian schools and in the media that really brought the hostilities to a crescendo in recent years.
I think your point about economic integration is a good one. If I can just say that, you know, when I was there in 2003 during the height of the Second Intifada, the one of the main opinions that I got from Palestinians that I spoke to, granted it was a small sample, but it was just anger that they had been in the process of building an economy, and now it had been interrupted by this stupid intifada.
Right, and that's in my opinion, one of the great sort of tragedies of this is that in why I say that there needs to be some sort of resolution among Palestinians themselves of who they want to be, because the sad reality is that terrorism and violence and the sort of the endeavor to destroy Israel remains, unfortunately, quite popular among a large number of Palestinians. There also is a large number of Palestinians who are sick of it, who don't want any more violence and don't want any more conflict. But the problem is that you need, in a society, to create a state and to move forward in peace. You cannot have a huge sort of minority in what is, according to a lot of polls, is actually a pretty solid majority of people who favor attacking civilians in Tel Aviv through suicide bombings. And the public opinion polling of Palestinians shows a sort of a schizophrenic picture where you have, you've got 50 or 60% of people who say that they want peace with Israel, and you have 50 or 60% of people who say that they also want to see continuing attacks on Israelis inside Israel proper.
All right, but I think to some extent you see that among Israelis too. The numbers are different, but there are a substantial number of Israelis, perhaps not a majority, but a substantial number who really themselves don't really accept the rights of the Palestinians to their own state. They've kind of resigned themselves to it. They'd like to wash their hands of the occupation, certainly. But getting back to what I was saying about the occupation is that, yes, there was economic integration. But as far as political organizing and allowing the Palestinians to start to build the institutions of an independent state, the policies of the occupation specifically were aimed at frustrating that. So I'm not saying that the Israeli, I'm not calling the Israeli government they were acting out of hatred. I'm saying just they viewed...
Yeah, it's just maybe perhaps it was a sense of their own strategic interests. Right, and the policies of the British occupation during the British Mandate was also to frustrate
that's absolutely right.
Jewish nationalists.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right.
And there was such unanimity, though, that a state was created. And at this point, you see the entire world in the form of billions of dollars of foreign aid, in the form of numerous peace conferences, in the form of lavish attention from the media and NGOs and the UN and the United States and Condi Rice and the U.S. State Department and successive Israeli prime ministerships, all throwing incredible resources toward the Palestinians to try to get them to become a state, and it just keeps not happening. And what I submit is simply that the reason it isn't happening is not because of a lack of organization or effort. It's not happening because there is no unanimity among Palestinians, not even close to there being unanimity among Palestinians, to enable the conditions in which statehood can happen. In Israel, the founding of the Technion in Haifa, which is Israel's MIT, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, happened 40 years before Israeli statehood, because there was a sense of working towards something and the need to build the institutions to make that happen. How many universities have the Palestinians founded on their own with all that foreign aid they get? I haven't seen
right,
that.
No, it's a good question.
This is something that this is in the Palestinians' hands at this point.
Well, no, it's not just in their hands. I mean, the occupation continues. And again, that's what it really comes down to, whether you feel that they can create these institutions, whether they can take hold of their own future, why they persist under a military
occupation.
occupation.
The occupation just ended in Gaza, and what have the Palestinians built there? The Israelis left them greenhouses, and they looted and destroyed them the second day.
Yeah, fair.
I don't know. I don't see a lot of evidence for this. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I mean, how do you explain what Duff Weissglass said about the Gaza withdrawal meaning to put the peace process in formaldehyde? That's one thing I've always wondered about. Mahmoud Abbas pleaded with Ariel Sharon to coordinate on the security over the Gaza withdrawal. Sharon didn't. I mean, what was that all about?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I think there was a lot of bad. I agree with Israel leaving the Gaza Strip, but I think you're right. The way it was gone about was terrible. But once again, I think this is an example that actually kind of bolsters my point, which is that if there was a very broad sense among Palestinians that peace and statehood was their main desire, the departure of Israel from the Gaza Strip would have been used as an opportunity to build an economy, to open up relations with the rest of the world, and to put on display the fact that Israeli territorial concessions will win Palestinian peacefulness and cooperation rather than aggression and violence. And the lesson of the Gaza disengagement is that when Israel withdraws from territory, it is met with rocket wars and terrorism. And
I just don't think it's realistic to withdraw from what's basically the world's biggest prison camp and say, okay, now build a state. I mean, I think there's a lot involved here that you're kind of oversimplifying.
Yeah. Let's move on to the next thing, just so we don't spend the whole.
All right, let's go to Hezbollah. What do you got to say?
I think things in Lebanon have sort of been getting bad, and I'm one of those kind of very disappointed March 14th supporters. I visited Lebanon after the war in 2006 and met with some of these guys, and they're people who I very much want to admire and do admire in many cases. But there's a terrible problem in Lebanon, which is Hezbollah, and we've seen over the past recent events that March 14th has really not been able to solidify its political authority in Lebanon, or really even solidify much of its suasion there. When March 14th finally decided that it was going to actually challenge in a substantive way some of Hezbollah's encroachments by dismissing the head of airport security at the Beirut airport, who happened to have been a Hezbollah guy, and also by trying to clamp down on Hezbollah's independent communications network in Lebanon, Hezbollah basically responded to this challenge to its power by rampaging through the country and occupying West Beirut, and basically making very, very clear that anyone who tried to challenge its supremacy in Lebanon would be dealt with very, very harshly and would be humiliated. And this was a moment that I think represented a great failure of American policy in having supported the Senior government for the past few years, and in having invested itself very heavily in the Lebanese army in the hopes that the Lebanese army would be a counterweight to Hezbollah. I think it reveals that the way that the U.S. went about giving money and weapons and training to the Lebanese army was really kind of entirely pointless, because the Lebanese army stood down immediately. And this fits in with my sort of overriding point about Hamas as well, which is that once again we are shown an example of the fact that Islamic supremacist groups like Hezbollah cannot be integrated into political processes, into democratic governments, or really into any sort of political arrangements, because these are groups for whom politics is really a step down as far as their stature. They're militias who try to dominate any system in which they are allowed entry. And we've seen that with Hamas, and we've seen that with Hezbollah. And the sad reality, I think, of Hezbollah is that the only way to deal with them is to confront and destroy them if possible.
And how would you go about that?
That's a tough thing. I mean, the only power in the region who could do that is the IDF, and that would require a sort of longstanding commitment, and that would require the support of the wider world to do that. And I don't think that kind of support is in the offing. And I think what we're seeing right now is essentially a slow motion military takeover of Lebanon by Hezbollah, in which the Hezbollah, for its own sort of internal PR reasons, is going to allow the government to sort of exist as a facade. But the government is not going to be able to have any real authority over Hezbollah. And we saw that a couple days ago, where the government agreed to the statement saying that, that was symbolic, but symbolically very, very important, saying that Hezbollah should be allowed to keep its arms. And it was always one of the basic premises of March 14th and of UN Resolution 1559 and all these different things, that one of the first things that had to happen in Lebanon, and one of the most important, was the disarming of Hezbollah, that you could not have a sort of state within a state, an army within a state, operating an independent foreign policy. And that has now all completely gone out the window. And I think it's an example of the Bush administration being kind of inconsistent in putting its alliance and the sort of Beirut Spring in a lot of its speeches and talking about it very proudly, but doing very, very little to actually back it up in a substantial way and take risks to do so. What's your thought?
No, I agree with a lot of what you said there. I would just, I wonder if you see anything that can be done in regard to the Turkey mediating between Israel and Syria. If you're optimistic at all about that track, if you think it's possible to pull Syria out of Iran's orbit, what's your feeling on that?
The problem with Syria is that Syria's basic objective in the Middle East, I think, is misunderstood. And I submit, and this is what, I'm not a Syria expert, but this is what I've learned from my friends like Tony Bedran and Lee Smith, who know this stuff better than I do, is that Syria's basic ambition in the Middle East, and it has been for a long time, is to sort of have as many different groups of people and countries and interests coming knocking on their door as possible, because Syria is one of those Middle East countries where the regime is very shaky. It's a minority regime. It's an Alawite regime which rules over a Sunni population. It's not a country with great natural resources like the Gulf states. And so Syria is, in fact, a fairly weak and inconsequential country, but has dreams of its past greatness and its conceptions of a greater Syria.
Right.
And so the way it sort of handles itself in the world is it becomes a sort of Grand Central Station for terrorist groups. And there's all these different it's sort of like the bar scene in Star Wars. There's sort of the rogues gallery operating out of Syria. And at the same time, Syria is always sort of throwing bones out to France, to Europe, to the United States, to try to get various Western people to come begging Syria to pry it out of the Iranian orbit. Yeah. And I don't think any of it works. I think Syria is trying to get itself off the hook. Yeah. It's been since 2005. In the Hariri assassination, a lot of countries sought to isolate Syria. And this little peace deal with Israel, I think, is incredible folly for the Israelis, but it's wonderful for the Syrians, because basically what it does is allow Bashar Assad it allows the sort of the diplomatic isolation on his country to be lifted. He can go and say that he's actually a peacemaker. He can say that he actually wants to be a constructive presence in the Middle East, and all the while he's glad-handing with the Iranians, and he's got the headquarters of Islamic Jihad and Hamas and various Hezbollah people operating out of his country. I think this is something that the Israelis should have been really pummeled by the United States on. Is this really kind of cynical and ridiculous this peace overture that has really no hope of working.
So we had the Israeli bombing of the nuclear facility. Then we had the assassination of Mugniya, and then it was a couple days ago. They say someone sniped him from a boat. He was on vacation. Yeah. He got shot 4 times from a boat.
I think that's fantastic.
I mean, from a boat.
I would be surprised if, just knowing what I know as an avid firearms enthusiast, sniper shots from boats, that's not a really stable platform.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
I mean, who knows how he was killed? But the reality is that this was one of Syria's nuclear guys, and importantly, he was Bashar Assad's liaison to Hezbollah. And this is now I think the third unanswered blow that the Syrians have taken to the sort of credibility of their regime and the credibility of Damascus as being a sort of safe haven for terrorism. And I think it was a wonderful thing, and I'd like to see more of it. These guys are real bad guys. And they contribute to a lot of very evil things in the Middle East. And I sort of, whoever did that, I applaud them for their bravery and their chutzpah. So
even if
what do you
even
think?
if it was even if it was
as cool as I did?
even if it was IRGC who did it? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, hey, who knows? But I would doubt that the Iranians would want to contribute to the appearance of their allies' weakness. That doesn't. I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me. But by the way, I really doubt the Israelis did this.
Yeah.
It's just very puzzling because the Israelis, Olmert right now is trying to put on a big show of sort of his seriousness as a peace partner, and trying to create some international affection for himself and some salience in Israeli politics. And it's puzzling to me that the Israelis would go and do something like this, knowing that regardless of who did it, whether some Saudi hit squad was out there or whatever, that the Israelis are going to be blamed for it. So it's sort of, I don't know.
Well, I mean, even if they didn't do it, they get credit for being a bunch of badasses.
Right.
So
let's talk about Iran for a minute.
all right, hey,
Let's
before
talk
we
about
go
Iran.
to Iran, let's just do very quickly what do you see happening in the Israeli elections?
Boy, that is one of those things where you could do like one of those flow charts with all the different scenarios.
Just very quickly, what do you think is going to happen?
I think that there's a good possibility that Olmert might actually have to step down because he will be indicted. In which case he would have to step down.
Right.
I think eventually Bibi is going to be prime minister again. But in the short term, there's a chance that Livni could end up, when Olmert steps down in September, she would probably win the Kadima primary, although Mafaz is about to officially announce his candidacy. He's going to run. They both have security baggage. And I don't know. I think neither of them are kind of viewed, I think, by the Israeli public as being particularly strong leaders. The Israeli public definitely wants there to be a general election. Yeah. But what I think there's a strong chance of happening is that all the weak people who know that they would lose in a general election are going to end up cobbling together an alliance to prevent that from happening, because Labour and Kadima know that they would both probably lose seats if there was such an election. So they will sort of pool their resources and prevent that from happening. So we could see Olmert as a sort of stand-in prime minister while all this plays out for 6 months. He could be prime minister until March of 2009. You don't know. But there's a million different things that can happen. I certainly wouldn't want to make a prediction on it.
Okay. Well, thanks. All right, let's move on to Iran. Let's see. Iran, we have the deadline that passed, the deadline of the freeze for freeze offer on Saturday. We had Assad in Tehran. Is he still there? He was there over the last couple days.
I think he came back.
Okay.
Maybe for a funeral he came back. I don't know if he was there.
And yes, that's right. But Ahmadinejad used the occasion of Assad's visit to announce that Iran will never
give up its nuclear
its nuclear program.
Yeah.
So we've got.
What do you think the Iranians? What do you think the sort of end game is for these guys? I mean, what are they trying to do with all of this?
I don't know what the end game is. I mean, a couple things here. I think it's important to distinguish, and it's too little done, between Ahmadinejad and Khamenei, because I think there are real differences between the two of them. I think Ahmadinejad is a kook. I think he's genuinely, into this hidden imam thing. I think this is, although I will say, whether that translates him into trying to bring about Armageddon, I'm not convinced that's the case, but I do think he's pretty sincere in his faith. Not to say Khamenei is less sincere in his faith, of course not, but I haven't seen any evidence that Khamenei is part of that whole school of thought. I think Khamenei is concerned primarily with preserving the Islamic Republic as an Islamic Republic. And this gets us to the whole question of whether Iran is, at this point, truly still a revolutionary power. I wouldn't say that it really is. I don't see that. I see Iran trying to pull levers and cause trouble all over the place and maintain and spread and bolster its influence. I wouldn't say that I really see Iran out there trying to foment little Islamic revolutions wherever it can. So I think at the end of the day, I think the nuclear program is a nationalist. It's a kind of nationally affirming effort.
Okay, we're back. We just had to swap out the pneumatic tubes in the basement. Okay,
That's right.
Talking about Iran's endgame in the region and what they're looking to do. I think everyone probably agrees on the idea that what the Iranians want to do here is they want to push the United States and Israel out of the region. The Iranians have a conception of their own grandeur and their own sort of prerogatives as being the supreme power in the region. I think there's an economic aspect of this that's kind of interesting, which is that over the years of the Islamic Revolution, there has been such profound corruption and mismanagement of the Iranian economy that the only thing that has really sustained the Iranian state as a going concern is oil revenues. Mm-hmm. And I think part of this also is the need for the Iranians to ensure to ensure their oil revenues. And one way of doing this is sort of fomenting crisis in the region, which drives oil prices higher. And so, the nuclear program will enable them to become this sort of dominant power in the Middle East. And there's a reason why they have sort of assembled this group of proxies and alliances that are specifically aimed at rivaling America's proxies and alliances. And that's why you see sort of Iranian client groups gathered on Israel's border between Hezbollah and Hamas, which Iran has sort of sank so many resources and so much money into, which is a way of making America's sort of posture in the Middle East and making the sort of American-Israeli system such as it is that prevails in the Middle East, put as much pressure on it as possible. And so you see the Iranians also acting in Iraq in this way. And I think that the nuclear program, it's become sort of fashionable among people. I remember seeing Andrew Sullivan write something about this a couple days ago to say, well, the Iranian nuclear program isn't that big of a deal for America because it can be contained and the Iranians can be deterred. So why make a big deal out of this? And I'm curious, do you think that it would be strategically smart for America to basically acquiesce to the Iranian nuclear program and then see if it could basically handle the Iranians from there?
No, I don't think we can accept an Iranian bomb.
Really?
I don't think that we've reached the end of the string yet in really probing Iran's intentions and seeing what we can do short of military action before Iran weaponizes its nuclear program. And I think
what about the issue of the yield test? I mean, isn't the red line the yield test, not the weaponization?
Right. I understand. I mean, weaponization is the small step. Enrichment. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think that's also too little understood. I mean, because of the way that the NIE was framed and all that. But as I said, I don't think we've reached that point yet. We've really dealt with Iran or tried to deal with Iran enough, short of military force. I still think there's a lot that we have to do. If we have to go to bilateral negotiations, I think that those are costs that we need to consider short of taking military action, especially since military action, in a best-case scenario, puts Iran's nuclear program back, a couple of years?
I think more than that. I mean, it would depend on... that would, by the way, depend, I think, on the level of shock that was delivered to the Iranian system by a strike. Yeah. I mean, if their navy was sank and, a lot of their people got killed and the nuclear sites were destroyed, it would be more than just delaying the program for a few years. It would put the regime in the worst crisis it's ever faced since it came to power 30 years ago. What do you think? What do you think the sort of the diplomatic offers? Which ones really exist at this point? I mean, we've had all sorts of activity from the UN and the IAEA and Security Council resolutions and sanctions and the EU 3+2 divided by 5 or whatever it is. Right. And this is sort of Obama's position, which is that we can what we need is the president to go, or we need the president's administration emissary from the president to go and talk to the Iranians directly. What is this person going to be able to tell the Iranians that hasn't already been communicated to them by the past 6 years of diplomacy on this?
No, I think first of all we need to take regime change off the table. I mean, I don't think you can overstate how unproductive it is to have the policy of the United States be that the Iranian regime needs to end. I mean, the idea that you can go into productive negotiations when that's your policy is just stupid. I mean, I find the Iranian regime abhorrent. But I mean, we can't expect them to sit down and feel like they're bargaining with us in good faith while our stated policy, while we are funding, groups to overthrow the Iranian regime. I don't think it's possible to overstate that.
Yeah, although the problem I find with the diplomacy here is simply that that the Iranians have basically, the regime is unanimous on one point, and there may be differences between, Ahmadinejad and some of the other guys there. I mean, there certainly are, but the regime appears to be completely unified on the strategic necessity of acquiring a nuclear weapon. So I submit to you that it is long since past time that we were involved in sort of this exploratory phase of diplomacy in which we were attempting to find out if there was some sort of incentive or some sort of change in policy that we could offer the Iranians that would stop them. I mean, I think if we went to them and said, we're going to basically set the Fifth Fleet sail for San Diego in Norfolk or wherever it goes, and we're going to eliminate our support for Israel, and we're going to scuttle that alliance and do all these things, the Iranians would still proceed full steam ahead on their nuclear program.
Right. No, I think
it is such a vital aspect of their need to sort of expand their power and to show that the Islamic Revolution is on the winning side of history.
I know, I understand your point, but I'm just saying I think we still need to find out whether there are certain things that Iran would accept. Securing the existence of the regime, having Iran's place in the Middle East recognized, and to allow some sort of transparency and inspections to make sure that they're not weaponizing. Granted, that's a tough question.
What if the response to that is the exact same response that the EU 5+1 or the UN 5+1 received this past weekend and today, which is Iran will not give up an iota of its nuclear rights, and we could also shut down the Straits of Hormuz if you try to mess with us.
Right, but again, this is all happening. Right, I understand, but what I was saying is that this is all in the context of the U.S. having as its stated policy the destruction of the Iranian regime, and understanding that Khamenei's goal is the continued existence of the Islamic Republic as an Islamic Republic. I mean, I think taking regime change off the table just straight out, I mean, that's something I think needs to be done to really judge where we're at with Iran. I mean, if we do that and it's still nothing to be done, okay, then we deal with that then. But I think we need to do that.
All right. Well, I mean, if taking American support for regime change off the table with Iran was part of a sort of a last-ditch diplomatic effort to try to find a peaceful way to stop the Iranians from wanting to build nuclear weapons, I would say, I mean, fine, if that's what needs to happen, that would be okay. But it would be shocking to me if that produced any sort of change in the Iranian position on its own sort of cause.
Yes, it may very well not. I mean, but getting back to the point of what I said about the Iranian bomb, it's not. I don't think the Iranian regime is suicidal, contra whatever Bernard Lewis is saying. I don't think that they want to invoke Armageddon. I think what's really troubling about the Iranian bomb is just, giving them freedom of action, the nuclear deterrent to allow them to do.
I think there's a few other things that would be terrible about it. One is that they would put America's Sunni allies, the Arab states, Jordan, the Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, these types of places, they would put these people, they would offer them a terrible dilemma, which would basically be, with Iran as the new superpower in the Middle East, they would basically say to these people, you have to now choose between your friendship with the United States and your alliance with the United States and our objectives in the region.
And then there's the proliferation.
I think with an Iranian nuclear weapon, America would lose an incredible amount of leverage with the Arab states that it's allied to. And America, this would, I think, completely undermine what Martin Kramer calls the Pax Americana in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Levant part of the Middle East, where there's sort of for a long time been a separation between the Gulf states and the Levant, and this is a way of Iran being able to sort of bridge that divide and bring chaos and bring violence and bring crisis to America's ally Israel, which is so far the most militarily capable country in the region. And this would upset a sort of shaky but essentially useful security paradigm that's ruled the Middle East since the 73 war, since the Arab oil embargo brought Middle East instability to America's shores. and that this would. And people say, well, what is Andrew Sullivan asked, what is the American interest here in preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon if we can contain them? Well, that's it. That this would end up significantly undermining America's position in the Gulf, and we would end up having $8 a gallon gasoline, I think, pretty quickly. And that's besides the whole issue of nuclear proliferation and whether the Iranians would share nuclear technology with other sort of rogue regimes in other parts of the world. So what you're saying to me is that you basically feel that the left and the right in America can sort of get together on a basic principle with Iran, which is that this country cannot be allowed to have nuclear weapons.
I mean, that's my view. I don't know if the left and right can get together on it. I don't claim to speak for the left, but my view is that an Iranian bomb, for a number of reasons, is not acceptable. But again, I think there are a number of things that can be done and must be done before we reach that point where we have to make that fateful decision.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you there. So how are we doing on time, by the way? Looks like we're at an hour here.
Yeah, we're at an hour. You want to do one more?
Well, they're going to probably edit it all out, right?
That's true. Yeah,
we're at an hour here, so it's sort of
okay. Well, thanks a lot, Noah.
Yeah, it was great talking to you, Matt. I hope we do this again soon.
I would love to.
Interesting discussion.
All right. Well, this is Red 5 signing off.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.